What do you guys think about the armor change? I was sitting last night thinking about armor, like, you know, normal human beings. Is the solution just to revert it back to a flat damage reduction, but then address the outliers that were too good versus that damage reduction? Slow down. Some of you guys might not even know what armor has done historically in Overwatch 1 or even what it does currently in Overwatch 2. So the history of armor is that in Overwatch 1, it always reduced instances of damage by 5. In other words, a soldier bullet that does 19 is going to reduce it by 5, and it's going to do 14 damage. And like a far rocket's going to do 120 minus 5, and that's going to be 115. And instances of damage that were very small, like for example a tracer bullet, it's not going to reduce it to 5 because it's going to be 1/6 of what it was before. It says at most it will reduce it to 50%, so 3 of what it was. So what it does is it introduces a 0.5 multiplier anytime the 5 damage reduction is too harsh. In other words, if you got these little tiny instances of damage like a Diva shot or a Reaper shot or whatever, it's not going to reduce 5 for each of that because it would just be way too heavy. So at worst, it's a 50% damage reduction, and sometimes it only does a 5 damage reduction. Now what they did is they changed it in Overwatch 2 initially to a global 30% damage reduction on all damage output, period. But the problem with that is that this wasn't harsh enough on a lot of the micro bullet heroes, characters like Tracer versus tanks, Bastion versus tanks, Reaper versus tanks, or Matcha versus tanks, and so on. And they found that tanks were getting kind of shredded by these characters a little bit too fast. So what they did is they went back to the Overwatch 1 thing of reduction of 5 damage, and then at most 50% damage reduction. Same kind of thing here. But then that led to another unintended consequence where now all of a sudden, just like it was in Overwatch 1, we've got Pharah rockets and Hanzo shots and a lot of other higher damage instances like actually just being totally shrugged off. We're also currently in a Pharah meta, which definitely didn't help things, the optics of things. But being a fully armored target, taking a 115 damage rocket definitely kind of sucked. Now, I might be getting a couple of things wrong with some of the details, so if you guys think I'm getting anything wrong here, please let me know in the comments. But overall, the general principle is still the same. Recently, though, this was changed so that there's actually a minimum damage reduction or a maximum damage reduction of 10. So this means that the Pharah damage is going from 120 per rocket to 110 with the same 50% multiplier maximum being applied. The problem with that 10 damage reduction is it had the unintended consequence of reducing things like, remember that soldier bullet? It's not going 19 minus 5, it's going 19 minus 9.5. Not quite 10, because 10 would have been more than the 50% damage reduction. But basically all you need to know is that it's cutting soldiers' damage on armor in half. And something like with Lucio was even worse, well, not quite half, but basically something with Lucio was even worse, where his damage was at 18, and again, it's going to half as well. Yeah, actually it is half for both of them. So yeah, it's really, really harshly cutting Echo, Soldier, Genji, Lucio. It's really, really hurting their damage versus tanks, which was not the initial intent of the armor change. So we've got this giant quandary of like, what do we do with armor to make it a slightly more effective versus these small Tracer, Reaper, Bastion, Tank Buster characters without making it totally useless versus bigger characters. And then without doing both, we ruin the characters that are somewhere in between. I think I found a proposed solution. We're going to talk a little bit about armor in this video. Let me know what you think in the comments, and let me know if I got any of these number tweaks wrong. I understand why they did it. They did it in an attempt to deal with burst DPS characters like Pharah that just were literally shrugging off the DPS, the armor thing entirely. But yeah, it had a lot of unintended consequences, like Genji soldier damage is terrible versus tank style. Like it significantly nerfed their damage. Lucio as well, right? So my question is, would this be better? Should they just go back to 30%? Should they just go back to 30% and then address characters like Bastion? So let's think about it. If they went back to 30%, right? What characters would be a problem? Diva, right? Diva versus tanks. She was very effective versus armor. Tracer. Yes, Tracer. Mauga, Orisa, Ramatra. Hog. Reaper Bastion. Right? So a lot of characters, like let's not lie. Sombra even, it's tricky, right? So if they go back to 30%, all of a sudden, a lot of these tank busters start to feel a little bit better. Is it even solvable, guys? Can you make armor function differently versus different damage sources? Is that possible? I mean, surely they can code that, but would that be too unintuitive? It does behave differently versus beams and DOTs. See, the question is if it's is it unintuitive if you can visually see the difference? Oh, wow, I do less damage no matter what type of damage I do versus armor. That's it. Well, the effect of armor isn't just damage reduction. Armor effectively speeds up. I mean, yes, but that's a side consequence of armor doing what it's supposed to do. Damage reduction is armor's goal so that you're able to be healed up under. Yeah, 100%. I think here's a hot take. What if? I mean, come on, it's already unintuitive. Like let's be very clear. It's not unintuitive. It's already a little bit complicated. It functions differently versus beams. And also, it does not apply consistently across all heroes. Remember the rule. It's always a damage reduction of 10 unless the damage reduction is more than 50%. You guys get what I'm saying? It does not globally reduce damage by 10, otherwise you'd literally do no damage. So it's already complicated. Right. So why could we not just reduce it to 5 again, but on instances of damage where the damage reduction is less? I mean, it's simple. You just reverse the calculation, right? So it's always a 5 damage reduction unless the damage reduction is less than 10%. So in other words, a rocket from far is 120. You reduce it 120 to 115. That's not 10%. So it reduces it by 10%. It reduces it to 108. Or 12%. Anything that's less than 15% damage reduction is put at 50% damage reduction per instance. That's it, right? Is there any way that would be broken? It already calculates that right now. It's just the opposite. You shoot a bullet, it does 5 less. If it cuts your damage by more than 50%, it's a 50. Okay, so let me draw this up for you guys. Let me cook. Okay. You're shooting, how much is a tracer bullet? 8? 9? I don't even know. How much is a tracer bullet? 6 damage. Okay, 6 damage. 6 damage when shot by tracer is cut to 3. This is multiplied by 50 or 0.5 because subtracting 5 would be too harsh. It would reduce it to 1/6, 17%. It's too harsh, so we apply the 0.5 multiplier instead. A soldier bullet does what? 20? Something like that, right? 20. We will minus the 5 there. Oh, hey, 15 is not less than half. Oh, 19. Okay, so 19. So we're okay with that. We'll let the armor do the normal damage reduction there and reduce it to 14. Everybody's happy. You got me? Now, all we have to do here, I say that like I know anything about coding, is insert a third calculation where the damage reduction for armor always has to be at least 15%. Always has to be at least 15%. So what you do is you shoot a far rocket. 120 minus 5 is equal to 115. Wait a second, that's not a 5% damage reduction. What is that? That's not near enough. It needs to be at least 15% damage reduction. 12 times 15, for those of the guys in the back, that's 180. So that's an 18 damage reduction. So it recalculates it to be at least 18 damage reduction, and that puts us at 102. So there's 3 separate calculations depending on how high the original damage source needs to be. So it basically, everything feels relatively consistent. Smaller instances of damage will still be hit worse. Larger instances of damage will still be hit less, but there's less extremes in the extrapolation. I mean, heck, you could even make damage reduction 20% at least, right? 20% of 120, 24, 96 damage rocket. This is pretty simple, right? Would you have to apply 15% to that too? I think you would. Yeah, I think you would. That's a great question. 15% damage reduction of Riptire. What does Riptire do right now? $600. So then you'd have 600 divided by times 15. So it'd be 90 damage. So Riptire would do 510 damage. So it would one-shot tanks, squishier tanks or tanks. Okay, good to know, Brax. That's it. I think this is it. This has to be it. Because what this does is this prevents things like Pharah doing infinite damage versus armored targets. Like she shrugs it off, right? It prevents Tracers from doing 0 damage, but still hurts tank busters as a whole. And it prevents things like the Soldier Genji, like a 19-5, where we're at right now, it's 19, it's not minus 10, it's 9.5. Right? What is Lucio's damage right now? 18? Is it 18? So it increases Lucio's current damage from 9 to 13. Yeah, so there you go. I feel like this has to be the solution. I mean, it's tricky because it is armor, and armor has always been a bit of a mess. But it's consistent. And the thing is it's the optics of it are fairly clear as well. This doesn't feel like a massive discrepancy, right? Like if I'm shooting a bullet and shooting a rocket, rocket still hit hard, bullet hit less hard, but not so disproportionately so. In fact, if we do the math, if this is a 15% reduction, this is something more approaching like what, 22% reduction, something like that? Something like that, right? Just so it's close. 27%? Okay, yeah, sorry. But yeah, it's close. And I think that this is where you can cramp numbers. So you can tweak this till the cows come home too. Like you could be like, all right, well, the tank busters are a lot weaker, but we've nerfed Bastion and Reaper specifically, and Malga as well. We don't need to be giving this 0.5. Okay, so here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna reduce this to, we're going to reduce this to 0.45 damage reduction. That's the harshest penalty you can get is 45% damage reduction. So it's not quite as harsh anymore. That way you can still have meaningful impact. Now you're probably asking, this isn't really designed to address Pharah rockets, although it will do that. Like right now, Pharah rockets are going to do 110 damage instead of 102. So it's still going to help the tanks deal with the heavier styles of burst damage, including headshots. But what it's going to do instead, oh, by the way, the headshot multiplier, that's a whole other thing. That actually discourages skill play. Not a fan of that one at all. If certain tanks are dealing with headshots worse than others, they should address the headshot hitbox of that tank, right? Anyway. Moving on. But what this does is this helps the middle ground. These poor guys that got screwed over. They were getting their damage cut by like 40, 50%, 30%. Yeah. So, anyway. The reason why this needs to happen is because characters like Soldier, Lucio, Genji, things like that were taking significant damage nerfs on armor. And these are also characters that are not brain dead either. These were characters that were not specifically targeted. This armor change was targeted for big burst characters like Pharah because armor wasn't working versus them. But it had the unintended consequence of really, really hurting other characters. I'm gonna cook here. I'm gonna drop in the content creator Discord. Maybe we can get some stuff changed.